I'm Stephanie McClellan, the Executive Director of Turn Forward. And first of all, thank you so much to Chairman Hochschild, to Adam, and to Ruth for a great start off to this conference. And I'm really happy to be here today to start off the panel discussions for this conference and for today. So the 5 new leaseholders is the panel discussion that we'll have today. And I'm going to invite our panelists to join us on stage. Well, thank you so much. And again, so happy to have you with us today. I'll just do a very quick name and rank and file, but then we'll get into the discussion here. So we have Lars Pedersen from Vineyard Offshore, Sam Eaton from RWE, Bryan Schueler at Invenergy, Michael Brown from Ocean Winds, and last but not least, Igor Volner from Equinor. Before we get started in the discussion, I'm going to take the moderator's point of privilege, or as point of reflection, and just to say that as a decade-plus veteran of U.S. offshore wind and as a keen observer of the sector here in California and in the United States, California's leaseholders are a fantastic set of players for California and for the U.S.'s first floating leaseholders. They're a mix of companies that bring a different number of different assets to California and to the onset of U.S. floating offshore wind. They are accomplished global companies with significant experience in wind and offshore wind. We have the company that was the first to fully permit a commercial scale offshore wind farm in the United States, no small feat, Vineyard Offshore. And in the case of Equinor, the operator of the majority of the global operating floating wind capacity in high wind Scotland and high wind Tampa. And not in any way to diminish by not noting the other companies, but just a couple of really key milestones reached both in floating wind and in U.S. wind on the stage with us here today. So really happy to be here with you, and here's how the next hour will unfold. As I said, this is a panel discussion about the key issues and what needs to happen from the point of the federal auction and leases being placed in the hands of your companies. It's a real transition moment, and we want to talk about what that means, what the key issues are, what's going to need to happen next, and what your aims are within that realm and that scope. We'll leave some time for audience questions at the end, but just to get the conversation started, I'll ask each of you to share what your company is aiming to achieve next with respect to California offshore wind. So I'm going to start right here to my left with
Thank you.
Lars.
And good morning, everybody. It's very exciting to see so many people interested in one of my favorite topics, offshore wind, and not least floating offshore wind. So I think what we fundamentally try to achieve here in California is to start an industry. We all have the lease rights to build that project, but I think we all share the common vision that we're not here just to build a project, each of us, but to be the first of what we hope to be a flourishing industry. So what does that mean? It means that we will develop not only the first projects, but a number of projects that are good stewards of the ocean, good neighbors with others who are living off ocean uses, but also in sort of being good neighbors with tribal nations and the communities, where we will develop an industry that will bring opportunities for a lot of people, economic development, but also bring clean, affordable power to the California grid that we all believe that it needs. And we think offshore wind is the right solution. So for us, it's very, very exciting. We're at the start of the process. It's a long road to get there. We have seen that elsewhere in the world. We have seen it on the East Coast, but I think Stephanie is underselling herself as a 10-year observer of offshore wind on the East Coast. She's done much more for the industry than that. But in less than 10 years, the East Coast has become one of the most vibrant, dynamic markets for offshore wind anywhere in the world, with the highest degree of local content being contemplated, and the IRA sort of setting off a whole flurry of activities that I don't think any of us could have imagined 10 years ago. So we hope to replicate that here on the West Coast, and we're very excited to be part of it.
Sam.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. As Lars mentioned, it really is great to see the growth and the amount of interest in offshore wind on the West Coast. I think many of us have been watching very curiously over the last several years to see how California was going to develop and when that first moment was going to be. And I think this week really needs to be an opportunity to celebrate what has been accomplished through the efforts of so many in this room and those that are here in Sacramento in the administration, the legislature, and the communities that will be part of these projects. They've done a remarkable job getting California in the right spot. For RWE, we are very interested in being part of California's clean energy ecosystem. We want to be a significant contributor to meeting California's goals around clean energy, decarbonization, and to do that in a way that sets up an industry that will support a just transition, creating good jobs for the communities that host these projects, as well as throughout California for those communities that may host manufacturing opportunities, assembly opportunities, and build the workforce that we need to build these projects and operate them over a 20, 30, 40-year life cycle. But importantly, just as Lars mentioned, I don't think any of us have made the decision to invest in California on the basis of just building a single project. It's instead looking at that long-term projection of where California wants to be and its neighboring states on clean energy. And when you do the math, you can quickly see that it just can't get there unless offshore wind is part of the mix. And we're very excited, very happy to be a part of that discussion. Looking forward to working with everyone in this room to make those projects and ultimately the industry successful, as well as the discussion this morning. So, thank you.
Bryan.
Thanks. Bryan Schueler with Invenergy. As far as what are we looking for here to accomplish? I mean, I think we're really here to listen. I mean, this is really early days for offshore wind in California. We're just starting off. It's going to be a long, complex road ahead of us. So we're really excited about being part of the 85 gigawatt goal. I mean, the decarbonization, electrification are creating tremendous demand here. We're an American company. We're headquartered in Chicago, and we've been in the renewable energy business for over 20 years. So we look at this as a springboard to both onshore and offshore renewable development here in California. And we're building a team, we're listening. We're going to try and seek to understand and create predictability so that we can deliver successful projects, because projects need to be successful for all of the stakeholders, for the constituents consuming electricity, and for developers, for suppliers. There's a large supply chain that needs to find success here. And so we're here to listen and try and build a path for that to be successful for everyone.
Michael.
Good morning, Michael Brown with Ocean Winds. I mean, I think these guys have covered it pretty well, but what I would say is that the first word that comes to mind when we think about California is opportunity. There's been so much done on the demand side. The electrification in California is there for everybody to see. I think that we believe that offshore wind is part of the solution in helping meet those goals for electrification. I think that it's clear when we look at the numbers, when we're deciding to bid, when we're deciding to buy a lease, that offshore wind needs to be part of the energy mix and part of the renewable energy mix for California. We believe that it can be additive to all of the great work that's been done. Obviously, offshore wind is in very, very early stages in California compared to the East Coast or compared to Europe and things like that, but I believe that we really can close the gap quicker than potentially we would even see. So I think that what we're looking for is really good engagement as part of these conferences. Delighted to be here, delighted to see so many people here. I mean, it's unbelievable to think that there's such a big crowd at a conference where we've only won leases 4 months ago. So it's huge. It's clear that there's an unbelievable amount of appetite both within the state and within the private sector for California. So we're extremely excited to be here, extremely excited to be one of the leaseholders, and looking forward to engage with California as a whole and looking forward to be part of that energy mix.
Thank you. Igor.
My name is Igor Volner. Can you hear me?
No.
Oh, good, thank you. My name is Igor Volner with Equinor, and you can see how collaboratively we are talking about these themes already. So I'm very much delighted to talk about floating wind in California. Equinor has 50 years of experience with large project developments in harsh waters, deep waters, and we have, I just want to say, 40 years ago, built the first floating project with a test in Norway. That's where we have de-risked that technology, and we're really looking forward to bring that competence and knowledge now to California. We now have around 5 years of experience also as an operator of a floating project. That brings us now to California 4 months after the lease auction. We are present here and we are here to stay. So we started in 2013 with our presence in California to build the industry, build the offshore wind California itself. But we will stay here to bring the benefits to the communities and work with the region. What I want to say that I believe in partnerships, and you can see the partnerships here on this panel, but I also believe in partnerships in this audience. We believe in partner with communities, the region, with the government, with suppliers. And this is going to be essential for us to be able to commercialize the floating offshore wind, which is not there yet. So we're working in the long-term partnerships. We'll be able to execute these projects much more faster together. We can talk about all the PPPT interfaces we need to talk about throughout this panel, but we can leverage our experience, which we have globally, but at the same time we need to listen. We do understand. We just are provisional winner. We want to hear from you. Last thing I want to say, what is in DNA of Equinor is what is in our name. It's equity, it's equality, it's climate. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much. And just to sort of, I think, recap or just kind of put a fine point on that, right? I mean, I think what we're hearing is that, as new leaseholders, really being here to make sure that we build an industry, that we, or that you build an industry, and, to help meet the goals and really to take and capture the full potential of offshore wind. And so, switching gears here into what's going to need to happen for you all to be able to do that, right, to do that work. And so I think you said PPPT, right? So those are the, why don't you, Igor, why don't you say what that stands for? Because that's what I'm going to go into right now.
Well, it's the known ones. It's ports, permitting, procurement,
there you go.
and transmission.
And transmission, exactly. And I'll add another one into that, which you guys all touched on, which was engagement. So let's start with procurement, because looking at the agenda moving forward for the rest of today and tomorrow, these are all issues that, of course, will be on the agenda, will be much more, discussed in much more detail. But I think setting a stage for those discussions and hearing from you about why these are so important, what it is that you hope to see happen. So I would just ask you, to share, if you would, the critical importance of identifying a pathway to procurement now. And for the layperson, procurement, what we mean here is, the purchasing of offshore wind energy generated electricity by electricity providers. A lot of times people say, what the heck are you talking about when you talk about procurement? So I'm trying to get out of the walk a little bit with at least some definitions here. But, what is the critical importance of identifying that pathway to procurement now? So I'll have you jump in. There you go, Igor.
I can try to lead the way on that one. Well, procurement is necessary really to de-risk the project for the developers on the very beginning. And I'm going to speak to why that is also important, not only for us, but also for California and the communities themselves. We've seen in the other markets that this is essential for progressing offshore wind. It was a great success in other markets, both to produce and incentivize the innovation, at the same time ultimately reduce the cost. And what we want to achieve is to create parity with a bottom fixed bottom fixed wind over time. But that's going to take time to get there. So I think what we need there, and we've demonstrated that with our projects, floating projects in Europe, is that it takes volume and scale and a bit of time to lead to this industrialization, standardization, scale, and that would lead us to ultimately decrease the cost. So I think I just want to say that. But all that is going to lead also to the great degree of benefits which this centralized procurement will ultimately foster for California and for all of us together. First, it's going to facilitate a very significant investment in local infrastructure, which is so necessary for success of floating offshore wind, such as, for an example, ports and onshore infrastructure. And this is going to be very much for the long-term benefit of California. Secondly, it provides significant funding in local communities, community opportunities, which need to be distributed on an equitable basis. That's something we can discuss, and this is fostered also by centralized procurement. Thirdly, it creates definitely a more structured and best opportunity for local supply chain. Local supply chain, workforce development, themes you mentioned at the end. And last time, floating offshore wind will provide the answer to California in terms of climate and in terms of energy reliability, which is an issue. So I want to finish off with saying that waiting for this procurement will, of course, delay potentially the projects, and there is a risk that stall development, we're going to stall economic developments also of the region. So there is really a ticking clock for us to do something about it, and we're going to be working together. I heard on a symposium yesterday, offshore wind being used as a reference to it's a silver bullet or a silver feather. I think is a great analogy, but we need this means to get to that.
I can just add to that. I mean, I think that Igor talked about all the benefits of offshore wind, and I think there are lots. One of the key aspects is that we all hold an unbelievable amount of risk as developers. There's about $750 million plus of lease payments up here. To get a project to FID or to an investment decision in order to decide to build it is hundreds of millions of dollars in the United States. And then probably to build a gigawatt of floating offshore wind, you're looking at a multi-billion-dollar project, upwards of $5 billion, which means that we could be $5, $6, $7, $8 billion out of pocket before we actually see a cent coming in revenue. That's a huge amount of risk to take as a developer, and one that we've all been very pleased and happy to take, and we're all, I love the expression, comfortably uncomfortable with the level of risk that we've taken. Having a certainty in revenue, having a procurement mechanism allows us to make investments now, allows us to have line of sight into a level of revenue that we're going to require in order to sell our power to make a reasonable rate of return. And then after that, actually securing the offtake contract itself allows us to make decisions which will come with constructing the project and all of the local stakeholder benefits and things like that that come with that. I mean, we do want to make this as inclusive as possible. We want to make sure that we are in the communities and we create those community benefits that everybody's expecting from such a huge industry on your doorstep. But to allow that enablement, we do need to see a reasonable, structured way of selling our power so that we can make those investments, so that we can continue to invest in these projects to make sure that we can be ready to deliver and ready to execute at the end of this decade, start of the next decade.
Sam, I saw your hand, and then Lars, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit, if you can. You had mentioned the progress on the East Coast, and maybe just a few reflections of the importance of procurement to unlocking those opportunities. But Sam.
Yeah. Well, certainly agree with everything Michael and Igor has said. There's a tremendous amount of benefits that offshore wind will bring to California, and we need the procurement framework to be in place to be able to unleash those. But the one thing to add to it, or maybe two things to add to it, is we're also having a lot of conversations with the stakeholder communities, the tribal nations, the local communities that we're working with. And many of them are asking us questions as to how we will engage with them. And we need to understand the procurement structure so that we understand the rules of the road for that engagement. And that becomes a bit of a bottleneck or a throttle for us in terms of how fast that engagement can go and how fast we can move with the projects. And then the second piece I would add to it is, just looking at the overall ecosystem that comes with the industry of offshore wind. It's not about just us up on the stage that are making investment decisions. There's small and medium-sized businesses that are going to be a part of this industry, and they're thinking about when are they going to make their investments, whether it be in the workforce that they hire or the factories they build, the equipment that they invest, as well as our tier one, very large international suppliers, whether they want to invest in California. And they need to understand that there is a very clearly defined market that's going to be here for the long term in order to support those investments.
Right. Lars?
Yeah, so you asked me about the lessons learned from the East Coast, and I think when I walked in this morning, it says the path to 25 gigawatts, and I think that's the way we should be thinking about it. So I think none of us are asking for mandates for 25 gigawatts, but we are asking that we have a visibility of how to get the first projects rolling, because I think we all believe that 25 gigawatt or beyond is where we're heading. So back to the East Coast, I think when the first leases or the lease that we are building right now as the first large scale, it was auctioned off in 2015, and because there was no mechanism or no sort of visibility, and the technology and the industry was immature, that was acquired for hundreds of thousands of dollars. You should probably have pocketed a few at that point in time if you now look back at it. But then Massachusetts put out the first procurement in 2017, did the first award in 2018, and at that time the entire East Coast industry was 800 megawatts. And now we're here, fast forward 5 years later, because of the price point that came in, because of the benefits that the industry is doing, because of the economic impacts it has on previously underserved communities and revitalizing waterfronts and building factories, we now have 30 gigawatts by 2030. We're looking at 80 plus gigawatts potentially on the East Coast, $130 billion of inward investments in the US, and as I said in my opening remarks, fundamentally the most dynamic, thriving markets anywhere in the world, and it's more or less created in 5 years. So there is precedent to look at of why procurement mandates are important, because it allows us all to invest, and it doesn't have to be 25 gigawatts. The East Coast started out with 8 gigawatts, and most of the states have done this. They have put out our long-term goals is to get here, and we want to take the first step, and I think we're all perfectly comfortable with that, but the first step needs, we need a path forward for that.
Right. Bryan, any last thoughts on the importance of procurement and why the audience should care?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I agree with everything that's been said here, and procurement is really important. I mean, it sets a signal, it sets the path for bringing certainty to the projects. In discussions with various folks yesterday, it's really clear. I mean, to meet the goal for California in the electrification and in renewables, you need different pieces, right? And every generation portfolio, regardless of what part of the world you're in, has different types of generation. And offshore wind is different than solar, it's different than onshore wind. Floating offshore wind is different than fixed bottom, and the cost profiles are different for all of those technologies. So it is important that there's a specific procurement for offshore wind here, and it fits a very specific need. I mean, you've got solar during the day, you've got onshore wind at night, and what we've heard is all the analysis shows that offshore wind fits that niche at the end of the day leading into the evening. That's really important for California to have this renewable generation mix. So if you're not specifically targeting procuring offshore and creating some type of carve-out mandate, whatever we want to call it, but there needs to be something targeted to make that happen. If not, and if you don't have the signals, all of the other things that my colleagues talked about that need to happen to support a project are just going to linger on, and they won't be ready when the industry needs it.
Yeah. Great, well, thank you. And I always think it's really important for the audience to understand why these things are important to them, so thank you for sharing that. So moving on to the next P, another P, permitting. So Lars, you made sort of reference to the long process, but once you have moved from provisional leaseholders to have your leases executed, so begins the long road of permitting offshore wind farms. And there's much talk about permitting reform in Washington. And before we get into specifically what needs to happen here in California, just do you have any specific thoughts about what you're hoping to see in permitting reform in Washington as it relates to offshore wind? And again, I'll open it up to whoever might be. Yep. Sam.
Happy to start on it. Well, I think, first of all, permitting reform is the wrong name for it. It's really about permitting modernization and recognizing that we are in a space where we are trying to fundamentally change the way that, particularly in our industry, energy is being produced in this country for the first time in 50, 60, 70 years, and the first time since NEPA was signed. And we really haven't had that very fundamental look at it to understand, does it still support what we're trying to achieve in hitting these clean energy objectives that we all support and want to be a part of? I don't think there's any interest from anybody on this stage or anybody we see in the industry of taking shortcuts or cutting corners in the environmental reviews associated with the projects. But when we're now starting to see the permit processes extending to 5, 10, 15 years just to be able to get the first shovel in the ground, it certainly raises a lot of questions as to whether that's going to be fit for purpose in achieving goals that we have in 2030 and 2035 and 2045. And if we can't make those modernizations, we really have to question whether we're going to be able to achieve a goal that we believe is fundamental to where we want to go. With that, then, I think there's a number of opportunities that I know a number in this room are looking at of ways that we can create greater predictability in the process and better outcomes in understanding how we go about conducting the environmental reviews. And I think that's going to be crucial to our success, not only as an offshore wind industry, but really as an economy to be able to achieve the energy transition.
Lars?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think modernization is actually the right word. And I think also just some of the lessons we have had from the East Coast, which is different in the sense that it's actually multiple states who are permitting projects that are essentially in the same body of water managed by the federal government. I think here California, we may have an opportunity because it's one state, and then there's the federal government, because I think also from those that we are consulting and those who gets an opportunity to feed into these projects through the permitting process, if you have many projects coming at the same time, fundamentally asking the same question as part of the same but similar processes, you also have, people can wear out because they don't have the capacity that, that's what we do for a living. We have, we're funded, we have consultants that are helping us, but if you're a tribal nation or your other communities, finding the time and effort to give meaningful input, if it just is one project after the other, asking fundamentally the same question in these lengthy processes, people can also wear out. And I don't think that's a good outcome for any of us, because we don't get the right input at the right time, and maybe we don't shape the projects or the industry in the way we should do. So I definitely think that finding the good middle ground, and as Sam is saying, I mean, we're not trying to skip over the reviews, we're just trying to make sure that it's done in an efficient way, and it is right now the biggest bottleneck for bringing this resource online.
Yeah.
I can just add, we've been present, some of us longer than others, in the US for 4, 5, 6 years. We still have 1 gigawatt permitted. There are 7 turbines in the water in the US. So there's a huge amount of enthusiasm about it, but we do need predictability. I think that's what everybody's saying. I mean, permits are your right to operate, they're your right to construct, and we need structured permits. We need legally defensible, buildable, executable permits. That's the core to everything that we're trying to achieve here. We need to make sure that what we can get from the regimes, and make sure that we understand the timelines and that there's a consequence to not meeting those timelines. Now, there's a discussion about what that consequence can be, but we do need to be able to, as a developer, understand that if you do submit your permits and if you are able to meet all of your timelines and all your obligations that sit on us, that the permitting, or the other side, whether it's the federal government or the state government, will also meet their side of the bargain. Now, I know that that requires a lot of effort, a lot of work on both sides, but we do want to come together. We don't want to cut corners, but we do want to be able to move these projects forward as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And then when we do get our permits, that legally defensible part, that understanding that what we are going to be able to build and that we can hang our hat on it, take it to financing, take it through our FIDs, and be able to construct these projects with a certainty that what we have is something that we can hold on to for our license to operate. So it's really important. I do think, again, modernization, it's a better term for it, but I do think we need to look at how we permit things and how we can try to improve that so that developers can give the signals to all of the supply chain and things, that there is a predictability, and allow us to really enable all the good things that we're trying to achieve, not just in California, but throughout the US.
Igor?
Just a brief sort of, maybe to switch to California, what California can do about it, because moving from Washington to California. I think the destiny is very much also in California's hands. We are really looking and waiting the September permitting roadmap, and I think all our eyes are on it, because we need, on one side, very much inclusive and engaged stakeholder consultation about permitting, but as everybody shares here, we need a lot of certainty and predictability. We've seen what's happening on the East Coast and elsewhere, how this can drag along. So I think what I'm asking here, and what we are asking, is more of a coordinated agency approach in general, and how we have a lead agency for permitting, understanding how jurisdictional conflicts between CEQA and NEPA are going to be handled. So there's very concrete items which are manageable also from California side. So to open up this is probably the largest floating wind market in the world, right? So to enable that, I think permitting is going to soon after the procurement, the second P, going to be as important to this whole now.
Yeah.
Can I just
Sure. I was just going to, as Igor did, sort of turn to sort of what needs to happen in California now, and then from your perspective, is that happening? Or Sam, however you want to take it in the conversation.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that and maybe use a lot of the same words, but a little bit differently. But I think Invenergy comes probably with the least experience with offshore wind. I mean, we've been in the U.S. We're fortunate to have a lease in New York now, and to recently be awarded a lease here in California. But we've done a lot of onshore permitting, and it's really no different. I mean, the term predictability is key. Understanding what information is needed to be submitted to consider what we're doing, and really understanding who the decision makers are in that process that we're facing, because they are big, complex projects. Decisions will be made throughout the permitting process. It's not simply fill out a form, get a permit once you submit it. And then we use the term modernization, and I think this is new. So to me, when I think of modernization in permitting processes, I think back to 15 years ago when we were permitting onshore wind. We were learning, the agency was learning, and we had to make decisions along the way. And to me, that's the heart of what the modernization is. We've got to be able to take what we're learning and implement it quickly into decisions that are meaningful to deal with the modern technology and what's evolving to today for these technologies. And so if we get the predictability by knowing what we need to submit and knowing who the decision makers are, so that there's clarity to the process. And that's the nature of any type of development you do, onshore or offshore.
And maybe just to add a little more color to the point, we have to remember here that we're not just permitting an offshore wind project. We're also going to be permitting port enhancements or construction. Those have to be done before we're ready to even start construction of the project, and that brings the timeline forward for getting some of this permitting right. And if you were to go to any of our major port facilities in California today and say, hey, we're going to do a multi-$100 million expansion, that's a major project. That would be a major permitting endeavor unto itself. Now we're tying that also to the success of the offshore wind project. And so we have to think about this greater picture that if we're going to achieve 2030, 2035 goals, these decisions and these processes have to be able to be accelerated in the next 2-3 years to be able to have that infrastructure in place to support the industry.
So switching gears, as I said, I was going to insert something into the PPET, and that's an E for engagement. And the reason why I want to insert it here, right, is that between leases, contracts for power, and permits, right, that is where, whether or not it's protections for workers and marine and coastal resources, benefits that are going to be created for communities, tribal nations, workers, supply chain. There's a strong expectation here in California that this offshore wind industry will be centered in the protections of marine and coastal resources, in the creation of benefits, and equity and inclusion. And so I guess, I just would, again, you're provisional leaseholders. I know you haven't been on the ground a long time. We've heard you're listening. But what can you share with the audience at this point about your work on the ground here, your aims for engagement, and just sort of what it is that they can all expect?
I mean, it's still early days. I fully agree with you. I think we need to find. I was actually trying to get the 3 Ps and a T to be 4 Ps, and now we have to have the E. So we need to find a way to bring it all together. But I think that is the license to operate fundamentally, the engagement. We need to find ways, and I think it goes for all of us. Some of us have been here longer than others, but right now we're in the phase where we're taking advantage that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So we want to listen. We want to understand what it is that what we should do, who we should engage, and how we should engage. But ultimately, I think once we have the fundamentals for a project that could be financed, I don't think you can build it without the proper engagement. And there's a lot of opportunity here because if we do this right, it is one of the largest floating offshore wind markets in the world already. With 25 gigawatts, it could for sure be something that is very attractive on a global scale. A lot of innovation will be happening, right from higher ed, the most advanced material science, some of the most advanced engineering in the world, to really day-to-day operations and maintenance, boats going in and out. So there's a lot of things that we can do, and we need to engage the local community, but there's also a lot of opportunity. So I think we need to explain what it is. I think that's what I have sort of taken away, that I've been doing this for 15 years, and I have a very I deeply feel that, and have seen it in communities also where I grew up, that this is what we do now. This is what people make their money off this industry here, and the manufacturing that we previously had, that's not around anymore. So this renewable resource and the industry is what we do, and I think we need to explain what it is the industry is, and then I think we need to find the solutions that make it work here. The good thing about this industry is we can't really move it somewhere else. It's big, bulky components, it's marine construction, it's going to happen close to these projects. So we will find the solutions.
The P is so easy, participation. Anyway, I move on.
I mean,
Michael.
yeah. Lars, you're going to get all your P's,
Yeah.
7 or 8
The
by the
5
time
Ps.
we're finished.
I'm going to print the T-shirt for everyone.
I was saying this yesterday. I think that when we won the leases, you get the notice from BOEM and you're like, oh, excellent, we've won. And then it's like you get a couple hours and then there's effectively a press release that's issued by BOEM about provisional winners of the leases. And the first thing you do is who else won? And it's kind of nice that actually we looked around and it was like experienced developers with US experience and worldwide experience. And I think that's extremely important. I think that we all have what I class is probably an honour to be the first leaseholders in California. I do think it's an honour. I think that we paid for that, right? But we also have to look at this as the start of an industry. The East Coast is something else and the West Coast will be completely different. And we are the first leaseholders, hopefully the first leaseholders which will generate the first 8 to 10 gigawatts of 25, 30, 40 gigawatts, which will help California meet its needs. And I think that's where we have to look at it from that lens, is we have to come together as a group of developers. We have to engage. Give us some time. We're building teams. We're making sure that we build local teams that are ready to engage with everybody and make sure that we're present in the communities that we intend to be active, but also in a wider California basis. And there's, a lot of coastline, so there's a lot to get around. So remember, it's a huge state. So I would say that we are trying our best, and I think we will be looking to engage, but we're looking to make sure that we do it in a much more thoughtful way, not to say that we didn't do it well in the East Coast, but just to say that in the East Coast there were incremental leases. So there was, small ones and then slow and build up, and you can see that through 5, 6, 7, 8 auctions over the years. This is the first leaseholding, and that means it gives us the opportunity to create something. It gives us an opportunity to create a different way of engagement where we try to come together as a group rather than engaging on a project by project basis and one-upping each other or things like that. I think we want to make sure that we come together. We act as a group. We have to compete with each other eventually, and we will do that through procurement and other areas, but we should try to not compete through stakeholder engagement. We need to make sure that we meet the communities, we need to make sure we meet the people, and we make sure that we have a positive experience for everybody, not this project's great and that project's a pain in the neck, but you have an overall experience as a stakeholder engaging with us. So we'll try our best to do that. Of course, we're going to have to engage in a project by project basis as well, but we will try to create as much of a unified, view of the world as we can.
Igor?
Just to add, I think excellent comments from Michael. I would very much support that. We are now, in a listening mode. We are trying to understand, and we are going to hear from the communities also what they want and what they need. I think what is important to say is that there is a new industry coming in, so we need to find also a good way for not to overburden the communities, overburden the processes. So this coordinated approach is really going to help, and we want to develop the workforce. We want to develop the opportunities for the communities in a consolidated, coordinated way. We engage even more. We have staff working tirelessly on this already now, but we're going to have a tribal liaison personnel and tribal and community and fisheries outreach. So I think this is the effort. We need to do that in concentrated way. We will follow also the California agency leads on it to do it in a systematic way so everybody feels involved and heard and appreciated.
Yeah, and I would also say, we also have to collaborate, the 5 of us here, and be aligned, because we will be using shared resources. Yeah. This is again a difference from the East Coast, where you have a multitude of states that all want to collaborate, but they would like all the activity to happen in their state. But we are now seeing an ecosystem being developed that is used across the very stage. This is, California has that right from the get-go. We will not be ending up building 5 ports, and all of us will be building 5 projects in the same year. That's not going to happen. The transmission build-out will have to be seen as part of a bigger build-out. So we also have a need to collaborate, and also that means that we will have to bring stakeholders, tribal nations, and others into that tent of how do we develop the first projects that set off a larger industry that has that momentum going over time. So we will also have a different way of working together than we may have had on the East Coast, where it has been multiple states, maybe more competing.
And I think just to maybe underline a couple of points that were made in the conversation, but we need to realize this is the first moments in a conversation that's going to be 5 or 10 years through the consenting and development process. And it's important that we get this early listening right, so that we can bring that feedback into the design of the projects and understand how it works and doesn't work for members of the community. And that's why we're all in this listening mode today, trying to better understand that. That doesn't mean we're ignoring the communities or we're not out there. I know all of us have teams that are out there in the communities in Humboldt County, for example, on the ground in Eureka and Arcata today, having those meetings, reaching out to the tribal nations, working with the fisheries. The last count I got from our team, we've had 40 meetings with the fisheries just in the last several months as we've been going through the engagement. Our team's been on the ground at least once a quarter for the last 3 years up there. And we're putting people on the ground today into that community so that we can make sure these discussions are ongoing and it's not episodic discussions, but instead it becomes more of a real-time feedback. So it is gearing up and it's getting going, but it is a marathon, it's not a sprint.
I mean, engagement's two-way, right? It's communication, and I feel like, BOEM, California engaged the industry. We've validated, through the leases, that there's an interest in offshore here. And California's engaged us with big goals for electrification and renewable energy. And again, I think we're here showing we're interested from our side. There's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of listening. We're starting to build our team around people who can be here for that engagement from all perspectives. This whole conference, the engagement of trying to understand what's next, what does California want to do, who do we work with, who are the decision makers. I think those are all real important things. But we bear a certain obligation through our permitting processes for engagement. But it's not all about just us. It's about everybody that's going to take to make this happen. So it's just the tip of the iceberg.
So switching gears back to the next P ports. And so again, this topic is certainly on the agenda. There will be much discussion about it. But from your perspective, what's your evaluation of the current state of ports assessment here in California? Are we headed in the right direction? What needs to happen? And I see Igor raising his hand. Oh, please, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this is a very important question, and we discussed it numerous times before. This is a long lead item. Ports development take time, and it's not essentially the best for the offshore wind developers to also be the port developers. So I think trying to avoid that and have a systematic approach to port development, I think it's quite important. There is a very limited number of existing ports. We need a good evaluation of that existing ports portfolio to be developed. We need both O&M ports, operation and maintenance ports, as well as staging and assembly ports in the proximity of both the north and the central coast. So that needs to happen. So acceleration of the port funding needs to be prioritized and needs to be understood, because we believe that those port funding will, of course, be a necessary stepping stone for floating wind development, but also provide good job opportunities for the generations to come. There's going to be permanent investments also in the Californian economy. And then if you translate that into the potential of these leases. So these leases have a 9 gigawatt plus or minus potential, but there is a 25 gigawatt goal ultimately. So I think there is something to discuss about a long-term staged plan of developing those ports for that bigger target, and how that is going to, instead of a scattered approach developer by the developer. But essentially I want to say that those ports developments need to be inclusive, they need to be climate focused, but very importantly, also they need to be cost and economically feasible. So I think if we can get those 3 things right, we're in a good spot.
Reports?
Yeah, I think maybe just picking up from our perspective up in the North Coast and with our partners here, or neighbors here with Lars and the Vineyard team, it's like a lot of the conversation we've had today. It's at the beginning of the discussion. There's a huge opportunity in Humboldt Bay, and that's been identified and been working with the local community. But if we take a long view between us as developers, as well as with potential port operators, the local community, the state, the federal government, there is the makings of something that could be extremely exciting in that community, and really could create a cluster of offshore wind activity in the region that creates a very long-term pathway, not only to the construction jobs and an almost continuous construction process through all the leases that could come in the Pacific Northwest, but also a very sizable operations and maintenance presence for each of those projects. And that helps us operate projects more efficiently. It creates a huge workforce development opportunity and jobs for that community, as well as a lot of investment that then goes into that port that not only supports offshore wind, but could be an asset for other types of heavy lift industries that might need to come into it.
Yeah, and I think this ties a little bit together some of the other discussions we've had, because now we're sitting and talking about we need a port, but fundamentally, as Igor said, I think we don't see ourselves as owners of an asset that will, over a 50-year lifespan, be used for multiple projects by multiple developers and maybe for other purposes than floating offshore wind. And we have the five of us up here. I actually noticed by a Freudian slip we have organized ourselves almost the way we are we have had our leases, so this is Team Humboldt, this is Team Morrow. Michael is the central one, he's even in the middle. But, there needs to be many more than us in this conversation, because fundamentally what we are an engine for permitting a project where we ultimately will be procuring a number of other companies in what we call Tier 1 that then will procure through Tier 2, their sub-suppliers, and then through Tier 3. And we will make a lot of decisions upfront on how the industry is going to be evolving, but that only extends for a certain period of time. We need to bring more into the conversation, not only the five of us up here. So we need visibility of the permitting framework. We need some guidance on where we're heading, because we will also close some doors when we open doors. And ports is one of them. Not all technologies will fit in any port, so we will have to make some of those decisions soon. So we need to have visibility so that we can bring more people in to this conversation. And ultimately, we will be employing hundreds, but the thousands will be employed by other companies that will then be contracted by us.
And perhaps fitting in the same category is transmission. And just in the interest of time, I just want to move to that last piece. Transmission is an issue in all places, and certainly California has its own unique issues. And again, this sort of broad question, it'll be a topic on the agenda throughout the conference. But what needs to happen today, as you sort of, I think, are framing nicely, right? Like, certain things need to be teed up that you guys can then unleash. And so what are those things that need to be teed up now, and are they happening?
I mean, for me, a route to market, procurement, whatever we call it, and transmission. Otherwise, the project is a road to nowhere. Right. So I think it's all recognized, and similar to the procurement, we need to have visibility on when it's happening, what is happening soon, and it's never an easy process. So for me, transmission and the route to market are the two fundamentals for us to be investing at large scale. Without that, there's no project, there's no industry. So I think that's extremely important.
And I think maybe picking up
what needs to happen.
Yeah, picking up on that, going back to what unleashes the next part of the conversation, it really comes down to getting that route to market, that procurement process in place that allows us then to think about what are the solution spaces that we need in ports and transmission to move forward. But when we get to transmission specifically, we need to recognize that the conversation we have about transmission is not unique to offshore wind. Going back to the modernization topic, right now we have a transmission and distribution system that's built around the way we produced energy 50, 60 years ago. And it was fundamentally different than what we're talking about today. And that means we're going to have to evolve that system. And the same very high levels of investment that were made in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to accommodate that prior system are going to have to come along to now solve the evolution of the transformation into a clean energy system.
I think transmission's an issue everywhere. I think that bringing the grid closer to the shore so that we can connect simply. I mean, massive infrastructure projects, and trying to add to that multi-layered, very complicated onshore network upgrades really does bring a level of project-on-project risk that people like us don't dislike massively, and it's similar with the ports. I think that what we're looking for here is an integrated view of how do we, as California and as the states as a whole really do electrify their network. They have to find pathways to bring the generation to the demand. We have to find the ways to get the generation to the load centers where all of the electricity is being used, and we need forethought, and we need people to think about how do we get the power there so that it's enabled for us to do that. And we're seeing some of the states in the East Coast really starting to think starting to really think that through, so that we're not having project by project, individual gen tie. We're still going to be there. We're going to have individual projects connecting because these projects are so big, but making sure that their point of interconnection is local at the shore, so that we can have our projects as reasonably simple as possible, because there are still massive technological challenges in themselves, and having the grid ready to take our power and move it to where the demand is huge. And I think it's a major issue, and it's one that needs real thinking now, so that we can have that connections ready, so that we can be ready to bring the offshore wind power that is needed to meet California's goals and really needed to meet the California demand in those shoulder hours in the evening, ready to come and make sure that we can actually meet that requirement.
I was just going to say, from a real practical perspective, it also helps set the pace to what we do. Just like the procurement, we need a line to when is the procurement going to happen, because that's going to trigger some of the next steps. Having a schedule, something that we can see as far as when will it be ready, really starts to formulate the actions we take and the timing and the pace of the project. So that's why it's important up front.
I was just going to turn very briefly to supply chain to say that the reason why I haven't added supply chain to this list of questions is because we've talked here, right, that the procurement, the transmission, or the route to market and the permits are what unlocks that. And I was going to say, but everybody wants to know, what is your vision for California's supply chain? And I'm looking now at the audience question, and that's the first question. So we'll turn to that. So and I'm going to ask whoever, I'm a middle-aged person with eyes that can't see that small, so I'm going to ask you to make those bigger if you can. But I believe it says, what are the next steps for developing a California supply chain to support offshore wind? How are you engaging with technology developers, and how can the state support the supply chain build up? Whoever would like to take that.
No, it's a good question. The reason why I'm hesitating is exactly what you're saying. I think that is also a conversation that needs to happen, but it needs to be boxed into what is it that the state wants to achieve. We have seen regimes where they only cared about the price of power, not about local engagement, not about local manufacturing. We have seen states on the East Coast prioritizing that in a different way. So the state is also, the state at large is also part of driving the conversation of what it is will be happening. So having said that, we can't build these projects without building them in Morro Bay, in Humboldt County. So we need to develop a workforce there, but what we have to develop beyond that, I think that's also part of the process that we're entering into now. What is it that California wants to? This is a novel technology. Somebody needs to be a leader in the world. It could be California, but then California has to ask us to lead that path and be willing to sort of support us in doing so. And if it's not, it will probably happen somewhere else. So there's a huge opportunity here, but we need engagement with the state, I would say.
And certainly agree with Lars. The first gating item in this conversation is, what is the procurement mechanism going to look like, and what is the box that we're effectively operating in to sell the power in the California's goals that are going to be supported within that procurement framework. But I think as you're developing that strategy, it's very important to think of where California fits within the ecosystem around floating offshore wind and a Pacific market. Clearly, there's an opportunity for California to be in a very strong global leadership position on floating offshore wind, and it should seize that. It really should take the momentum that it has over the last 2 years created to get to this point, to establish itself as the leading floating offshore wind market. But recognizing then that it may not have all of the primary skill sets or the best options for every component of that supply chain, whereas neighbors that we have just across the Pacific Ocean can very easily supply some of those basic raw components into assembly facilities here in California or advanced manufacturing facilities in California. And thinking about that global system will result ultimately in better projects and more affordable projects for everyone.
I mean,
Michael?
I'll quote President Biden because it's something that we all feel the pressure of as developers. When I think of offshore wind, I think of good paying American jobs. I think that's exactly what it is. I mean, I think we understand, we all know the supply chain, so any notion that we're not already taking the steps as how we are going to enable the supply chain in California, those conversations are happening. Typically they happen at the tier 1 level, which is really the contractors that we're talking to on a day-by-day basis, whether it's on the East Coast or in Europe or in California, and we're talking about how do we enable that and how do we make sure it works. I think for us as developers, it's a pathway. You know, we're in early stage development, we're doing surveys and spending tens of millions of dollars on the leases rather than the hundreds of millions of dollars that will ultimately create the projects or see the construction and operation of the projects in billions of dollars. So I think there is a pathway. You will start to see benefits immediately because as we look to spend money in local communities and surveys and things like that, but we do need to create a pathway. We need to understand what California wants, and that's where we really need to engage and really see how do we fit in and make sure that we're not trying to give too much but not too little, and then make sure that there's a balanced approach so that we can build out our projects but create a footprint that allows the enablement of multi-gigawatts of future opportunities in California, and we do it in a reasonable way. So I think it's a huge conversation. I think it's one we're all going to have individually, but then try to have collectively as well so that we're not wasting money but making sure that we make the most appropriate and beneficial investments.
I'm going to turn to the next audience question here, focus in on the part about what's unique about the California market. So I think somebody referred to the hundreds of millions of dollars that collectively have been spent by Lease. It's not an undertaking that's taken lightly. So what is it about California that drove you to be the first movers in this market and to take that step?
I mean, we're up here, I mean, I don't think complaining. I think that's probably a push too much, but certainly we're talking about the 3 Ps, procurement, permitting, you know, all these 5 Ps, however many Lars wants. But I think that, you know, we were, when we went to go and take these hundreds of millions of dollars investment decisions, we sold a vision, or, you know, it's a belief system. And I think that's the thing that's most important about California as the market, is that we all believe fundamentally that California will get this right. That is a state that is far ahead of any other state, probably in terms of the electrification and really pushing that demand side, and we've all talked about it. And I think there's a huge amount of excitement from us to be part of that and to be part of overall electrification in California, and I think that's where it's different. But what I would say is it's a belief system right now, and the pressure is on us, and when I say us, I don't mean the 5 of us, but I mean this collective group that's in this room to really get it right and to start to turn beliefs into realities, whether that's on procurement, ports, permitting, some other P that Lars makes up. I mean, I think that we're going to have to see that. So I think that's the key, is we do need to start to move that forward, and that's why we're here and really want to be present, because I think that's important.
Igor?
Yeah, we are California. I started to believe in it 10 years ago. So we had a long-term, I guess, vision. And it was only last 2 years when things started to gel. So it took a lot of perseverance and patience, really, from all of us together to get what I think there is. One thing which is very unique here compared to the East Coast. I mean, we have one huge coast with loads of floating potential resources and wind resource compared to different states, different offtake regimes and issues in other jurisdictions. And here we also see a willingness and focus to advance floating wind in a much larger scale. I would say sometimes it's good to be second. And here, California is unusually second. Usually in all items they're in forefront. Here we can learn, here we can leverage and translate those experiences. So I think the fact that this is such a significant push now, we have experience from elsewhere, we're collectively bringing it together and trying to put it in the context of California and listen to how to adopt to here, I think is a unique opportunity, and this is what is making this extremely attractive.
I think you can summarize it with one word: conviction. And California has clearly demonstrated its conviction to a carbon-free economy. Mm-hmm. And with that, it aligns with the interest of at least RWE, and I imagine everyone on this panel. We want to be a part of that.
I think I was just going to say, one thing that's really unique about California is going to be the tremendous opportunity, because the East Coast is fairly fragmented, right? It's multiple states with, as Lars said, different objectives. I mean, California's starting here, and even though there's no procurement today, we're here because of the belief that they've got the drive to do it. You've got kind of a clean slate to really do it right and to do it better than anybody else. So to me, that's the thing that's the most unique about California, is just it is clearly opportunity to do it right.
Yeah. I think that's a great question to end on, and also I'll just say this, as we are out of time, but the takeaways, at least from my perspective and listening to you all, the opportunity is enormous, and we need to take the long view, right? That it is your duty to listen, to engage, to include, to encourage participation, and that the certainty, though, that allows you to do all of that and create all of that opportunity is what really needs to happen next. And so whether or not that's procurement, whether or not that's transmission, whether or not that's support infrastructure, or whether or not that's a permitting roadmap that makes sense. And so I want to say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you. I wish you all the best of luck. And I'll ask the audience to join me in thanking you.
Thank you.